Luke Thomas was recently asked about his thoughts on MMA fighters using psychedelic therapy, and in this video, I'm going to help him out to try to explain some of the science behind it, considering, straight up certified donk. Morning Combat is my favorite podcast over here, as well as provide some pushback to Luke's intelligent use case argument. With that being said, hit the intro, eh? What the fuck is going on, donks? It's Ashcon, aka Dropped Out Beats, back again with another Addiction Neuroscientist Reacts video. If it's your first time tuning into the channel, in the comments below, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe, hit the like. With that being said, we're going to get into it. My name's Ashcon, aka Dropped Out Beats. I'm an addiction neuroscientist and hip-hop producer, and I'm a big fan of Luke Thomas. I'm always in the live chat, watching the live chats, watching Morning Combat, as you can tell. Big supporter of all that him and Brian Campbell do over there. And so today I thought I would kind of riff off of Luke and provide some science behind how psychedelics and a greater class of drugs called psychoplastogens may help MMA fighters deal with CTE, or, football players, skateboarders, BMX riders, whoever develops CTE. These psychoplastogens or neuroplastogens may be a viable tool to help treat CTE, expand the brain, stop the brain cell loss. And so while we don't have a lot of good, hard clinical trial data on that, I'm going to kind of go into the philosophy and the science behind it, because we do have some good preclinical data that it might be helpful. So with that being said, please hit the subscribe, trying to get these numbers up, get in the comments if you got a question down below, and I'm going to make my ugly self small. We're going to make Luke's Professor Salt and Pepper beautiful face big. We're going to get into it.
Question unrelated to MMA. We've seen many athletes, particularly in the UFC, i.e. Rockhold and Izzy, speak about psilocybin therapy. Your thoughts on psilocybin therapy and athletes speaking about it publicly. P.S. Oregon legalized its use, and clinics are now fully operational, with Colorado poised to legalize it later this year, and Australia already having a bill legalizing it. I've not done it, so I can only speak about the things that I read about it, and that is, of course, fraught with any number of different difficulties. A couple of things. There is some research to indicate, you're asking about psilocybin, but there is some research to indicate that ketamine, again, under a very managed system and a managed protocol and a managed administration to you, might be able to treat certain things like depression. I think the research on that is a little bit incomplete, actually a great degree incomplete, so it's not hardly conclusive.
So I'm going to push back on Luke here and say that we already have an FDA-approved version of ketamine for the treatment of depression. It's called S-ketamine. It's marketed as Spravato. It's actually a nasal spray. Pretty interesting stuff. And so there's two what are called enantiomers of, I fucking hate that word, of ketamine. There's the R enantiomer and the S enantiomer. And so the R enantiomer is more active at receptor sites that lead to psychoactive effects, let's say, and the S enantiomer is less likely to produce those effects, but also has strong antidepressant effects. And so we already have one FDA-approved treatment in S-ketamine in the form of a nasal spray, Spravato, for the treatment of depression. I believe it's treatment-resistant depression that it's specifically approved for. But we are starting to find that the R enantiomer of ketamine, or a racemic mixture being both R and S ketamine, can be useful in the treatment of depression, specifically as it relates to suicidal thoughts and anhedonia. And anhedonia is a major issue on depression, or a major factor in depression, being that people don't have the drive to do anything. And so ketamine seems to help address that. And there's still a lot more clinical trials to be done on this, but just to kind of give a clear answer to that question, we do already have one FDA-approved treatment of ketamine, being Spravato. You have to obviously have a prescription, but it's not the psychedelic assisted therapy that Luke is kind of thinking about.
but that appears to be something that there might be there, but that also remains inconclusive. It seems like there could be, but we don't know. As it relates to psilocybin, I do think that there is a significant amount more information about its potential, actually its real benefits in treating any number of different psychological disorders or various difficulties. But you have to understand something about the Oregon system. As I understand it, like it's not difficult to get per se, but they don't just give you the drugs and then let you take it. My understanding is you have to have almost like a chaperone under these managed use cases where when you take these drugs, you are.
Okay, so I'm not going to comment on the legality of the Oregon system or anything right now. I'm just going to purely get into the science of how psychedelics may actually help treat a variety of psychiatric issues, but also in the future, if you go back and watch my MDMA assisted therapy video, I start to discuss how I think the future of this psychedelic renaissance is going to be a battle between the psychoplastogens and the neuroplastogens. The psychoplastogens would be things like psychedelics that induce what psychiatrists typically call like a hallucinogenic trip or a trip, whatever you want to call it. Whereas the neuroplastogens do not cause any psychoactive effects and only lead to the neural pathways that cause plasticity, meaning, we create new neural pathways that might help in the treatment of any number of psychiatric disorders. But so, with that being said, let's kind of get into the real nerdiness of this and the pharmacology of this, because that's what this channel is about. You know what I'm talking about? So, for the pharmacology aspect, we break hallucinogens, psychedelics, really the greater class of drugs, we call them hallucinogens now. And so hallucinogens are broken into psychedelic-like, which would be considered the dissociatives being ketamine, the entactogens being MDMA, the deliriants being scopolamine, and the 1-irogens being ibogaine. This was the first time I had heard of that term, but if you're unfamiliar with ibogaine, it seems to... There's anecdotal evidence in the addiction community that ibogaine may help treat addiction. We need some clinical trials on that, but yeah, that's kind of the thought process there. We further break hallucinogens down we have the psychedelic-like hallucinogens, and then we have the psychedelics hallucinogens that are serotonergic in nature. And so all of these psychedelic-like compounds don't necessarily target the serotonin system as its main pharmacological target. For ketamine, for example, it targets glutamate primarily. MDMA is kind of a promiscuous drug. It can target dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and so the quote-unquote real psychedelics, as we think of them, target serotonergic signaling, primarily serotonin 2A receptor signaling, and then a number of other serotonin receptors. But these psychedelics can be broken down into two chemical classes, being phenethylamines, which mescaline is a perfect example of a phenethylamine. But if you look into it, this is actually very interesting. Amphetamine is technically a phenethylamine, which means amphetamine is a psychedelic compound. We are finding more out that amphetamine does actually hit some serotonin receptors and serotonin circuitry. We don't know. It obviously doesn't behave like a psychedelic totally in the brain, being that it hits these serotonin 2A transmitter or receptors and does all this weird stuff. But yeah, little side note, amphetamine is technically a phenethylamine, making it technically a psychedelic by chemical nature. And that's why if somebody says we should use amphetamine as an active placebo in MDMA trials, you're going to get immediate pushback to that, not only from an abuse liability standpoint, but from a chemical standpoint, that amphetamine is itself a phenethylamine and does induce psychedelic-like neuroplasticity. Now, we also have the tryptamines, which we typically think of being, the classic psychedelics of LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, which once you take psilocybin mushrooms, psilocybin is then broken down into psilocin, which is the active psychedelic compound in psychedelic mushrooms, and DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine. So now that we kind of have that basic, chemistry aspect down, let's move into the science aspect. And so here we can just kind of get a zoomed in view of what we are looking at. Can I make myself a little smaller so you guys can see this better? Yeah, made myself a little smaller. Okay, so you can see here, this is, all of these references will be down in the description below. Again, this is a real science channel. We're not influencing, just telling you to fucking raise your dopamine. That's a crock of bullshit. We talking real science over here. References are down in the description below. This is from an article by David Olson, I believe, where he is discussing the idea that psychedelics and psychedelic-like compounds can be what are called this psychoplastogens, like I was saying before. And so with psychoplastogens being LSD, DMT, and this DOI is actually a form of amphetamine, we see increased neurite growth, spine density, and synaptogenesis. So here is a neuron that has not experienced a psychoplastogen. Then we see the neuron go through experiencing a psychoplastogen, and we see increased dendrites down here, if you can see them, which is then going to allow for increased synapse area, which is then going to be functional neuroplasticity because we're gaining new neural circuits. Let's go further into this, get even more nerdy about this, and let's kind of look at how psychedelics or psychoplastogens may help with CTE. Now, I'll kind of tell you guys at the outset, I'm super opinionated on this. I am skeptical of the idea of I'm skeptical of the idea of neuroplastogens becoming a frontline treatment for things like depression, treatment-resistant depression, those mood disorders. We have a wealth of literature that suggests that the psychedelic experience may play a role in helping to treat depression. At the same time, the psychedelic experience can be very challenging and result in bad trips, possibly. In these controlled settings that Luke was talking about, we've already had a number of issues in the MDMA therapy sessions that weren't reported, sexual assault being the biggest gross, disgusting one of them. But yeah, and so I think the neuroplastogens are going to become maybe the biggest, could possibly become one of the biggest frontline treatments for MMA fighters dealing with CTE, because maybe you don't need a psychedelic experience, or maybe you don't even want one, to help treat your CTE, your chronic traumatic encephalopathy. If you haven't watched MMA on Point's documentary on CTE, I highly recommend it. But so here we can see neuronal cell loss as a result of ROS, being reactive oxygen species. I actually worked in a toxicology lab for 2 years where we studied ROS. And so ROS, reactive oxygen species, are basically these toxic chemicals that get formed from, eating a variety of things like overly burnt food and stuff that can get into your bloodstream. It's not like the biggest deal in the world. Don't go looking at, conspiracy theorists about ROS. No, this is like, for example, so an MMA fighter might have a huge amount of ROS in his brain from fighting all the time that builds up as the metabolism is sped up in his brain from being punched so much. And so that's going to lead to neuronal cell loss, which is then going to increase in inflammatory cytokine upregulation, hyperactive blood inflammatory microglia, which is then going to result in a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. How could psychedelics and psychoplastogens, neuroplastogens treat this? Well, we see that they could interact with a variety of receptors. We're going to get really nerdy here in a minute, to increase what's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, to then increase the neurite growth. We're going to see more dendrites. Therefore, we can start to see more neural pathways. We can see here this would result in neuroprotection, neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, slower disease progression. These microglia are critical in your brain. They help clean up all the junk debris in your brain that's going on and help recycle a lot of neurotransmitters. I don't want to get too nerdy about microglia because that's not what this presentation. That's not what this YouTube video is about. But so yeah, we could see that psychedelics, neuroplastogens seem to be a viable treatment in the future for MMA fighters to help treat their CTE. So now let's get really nerdy into the science of the pathways. And then stick around to the end of this video where I'm going to kind of refute Luke on a philosophical level about this intellectual use argument. So let's get into the real nerdy stuff. Again, references, citations, whatever you want to call them, down in the description below. So this is from an article where I thought this was just a nice, simple, good for the layman overview of how psychedelics may lead to neuroplasticity. We have a number of different pathways being TRKB, which we're going to look at in a minute. We have AMPA receptors, which are a glutamate receptor. We have mTOR, which is responsible for gene expression. We have CFOS, which I have more to learn about. We have brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which we're going to look at as a receptor that leads to gene expression. And we have serotonin 2A receptors, which may also play a role in the psychedelic-induced neuroplasticity for those drugs that target serotonin 2A receptors. But we have some pretty good science that serotonin 2A receptors may not be the whole story of psychedelic-induced neuroplasticity. Namely, let me try to zoom in here just a little bit, and then, whoops. Zooming in didn't do much for us. Okay, so when we're looking at this neural junction, this synaptic junction, on the left we have glutamate, on the right we have serotonin. So on the left, this is going to be more of the ketamine neuroplasticity induced side of things, and on the right we're going to have more of the serotonergic psychedelic induced neuroplasticity side of things. And so we can see this TRKB receptor here that's going to be responsible for neuroplasticity, because we start to initiate a second messenger cascade that ends in mTOR going into the nucleus, activating gene expression. We can start to see new dendrites form on the serotonergic side of things. I don't really know how nerdy you guys want me to get into this, so comment down below if you guys want me to get super nerdy in the future. On the right-hand side of things, we have the psychedelic serotonin side of things, where we can see that serotonin 2A receptors result in a second messenger cascade that ends in IP3 signals released from the calcium from IP3 signals in the endoplasmic reticulum that can lead to synaptic plasticity through CAM-K induction of gene expression. And so that's kind of, the end goal of all neuroplasticity is how can we get the genes to be expressed to make new synapses. Now let's look at how we actually know this information. Some of the scientific experiments that help us understand that these are the neural pathways that regulate psychedelic-induced neuroplasticity. So if you can see here, zoom in just a little bit more. So if we look at this graph right here on the right of these neurons that have been treated with either vehicle, which is basically placebo, being nothing. Well, not nothing. The vehicle is actually what carries the drugs in the other two syringes. And so here we have vehicle, we have LSD, and we have psilocybin. If you look at the dendritic growth of LSD and psilocybin in this top row from the wild type mice, we see that they have a significant increase in dendritic growth. However, we have a genetically modified mice of that prevents this Y433F gene from being expressed that plays a major role in TRKB signaling that basically prevents normal TRKB signaling, and we see we don't see any psychedelic induced neuroplasticity from these mice. And so what that tells us is that the TRKB receptors are necessary for this psychedelic induced plasticity. If we go down here and look, let me see, where was my other graph that I wanted to show you guys? Okay, here we go. If we look at BDNF expression, remember, BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If we look at BDNF mRNA expression, I'm trying to really zoom in for you guys so you can see this here. We can see that animals treated with LSD showed a significant increase of BDNF mRNA we're starting to see gene expression of new BDNF 1 hour after LSD administration. Had a burp there. Then, 24 hours after LSD administration is when we see the actual increase in the BDNF molecule expression itself. And so this gives credence to the idea that psychedelics utilize the BDNF pathway to induce neuroplasticity. Now let's look at one more thing that I thought was interesting from our TRKB mice. So yeah, this was what I was going to show you guys. So if we look at this graph here, we can see that there is a significant increase in the number of dendritic spines in the wild type normal mice when they are treated with LSD and psilocybin, meaning they show an increase in neuroplasticity. But if we stop this TRKB signaling pathway from functioning correctly in the Y433F mice, we actually see that neuroplasticity is prevented, and therefore we know that the TRKB signaling pathway is necessary for psychedelic induced plasticity. We see that here as well in this spine graph with the TRKB mice in blue here and the vehicle in black. And so all of this is to say we have really good evidence that psychedelics may help in increasing neuroplasticity, which may help prevent brain cell loss in fighters dealing with CTE. And so big medical area in the future. In the next 10 to 20 years, I think this is going to be a huge medical area, especially for the neuroplastogens, because maybe it is the case that these MMA fighters need, I don't know exactly what the dosing schedule would be for a neuroplastogen, so bear with me on this. They're going through phase 1 trials for just depression right now. I actually know people that work in these fields, and so yeah, I'm going to be really curious to see if the neuroplastogens really take off for guys with CTE as opposed to the psychedelic psychoplastogens, because maybe we don't really need a whole psychedelic trip to help you with your CTE symptoms. Maybe we just need the actual molecule of a neuroplastogen to help increase synaptic growth. And so with that being said, I'm going to make myself small again, and we're going to get into this philosophical argument that Luke provides of intelligent use cases, although this video is already going to be an hour long.
Monitored, the process is controlled for, the dosage is controlled for, and to an extent the experience is controlled for. And under those sort of stricter guidelines, there tend to be some what appear to be observable benefits. The point I want to make here is, and I say this all the time about every single drug because it is true about every single drug, whether it is recreational, whether it is medicinal, whether it is some combination of the two or performance enhancing, There are intelligent use cases, and then there's everything else. And what the trick seems to be for just about every drug, although that's not the case everywhere, is there have to be certain limits on it. And then within those limitations, there have to be a clear understanding of what an intelligent use case looks like, and then strict adherence to that. So I think more needs to be understood about the process, and Oregon might end up serving as something of a bellwether for a larger, I don't know, revolution in, I won't say it's not physical rehabilitation, but sort of mental rehabilitation work. But as I understand it, even under those considerations, it's not as simple. Like for marijuana, you can just go and buy it, and it has some benefit, obviously, in different ways, not so much for depression per se, but
marijuana might have benefits for depression. We don't really know. We don't really know what benefits cannabis has, and so that's something to keep in mind. We hear anecdotal evidence about cannabis having benefits, but we don't really have any good clinical data to suggest that cannabis does have benefits.
It has other benefits, but that, I mean, it's such a minimal drug that you can kind of administer it almost however you want. That's not quite true, but in general, with this, it's a much, as I understand it anyway, it's a much more controlled process.
Yeah, okay, so I want to provide some pushback to this idea that drug use has to be in this like controlled process, because Luke is talking about intelligent use cases, but inherently recreational drug use is not an intelligent use case. Now, you may start to get into the philosophical, over-intellectualization of this, which is kind of what Luke does to me, where we say, oh, well, my recreational drug use is okay. I'm using alcohol to relax. I'm using cannabis to relax on a Friday night. And in my mind, this country has a system set up that enforces the moral and ethical problems of drug use, being that our society and our culture sees drug use as an ethical and moral problem, when drug use, regardless of whether it is medicinal, recreational, is an amoral problem. Being a substance or having a substance use disorder is not a moral issue. And so to me, Luke's intelligent use case argument emboldens those who find that drug use is an ethical and moral problem. People like Sagar and Jetty, who is a massive hypocrite. Please go watch my video on his anti-cannabis propaganda. And so I would push back on Luke in saying that we need to actually stop thinking about intelligent use cases, because, Luke, I don't mean to pick on you here, but can you tell me the difference of what makes a drug a medicine versus a drug? Comment down below if you can tell me the difference between when a drug stops being a medicine and just becomes a psychoactive recreational drug. I'll tell you the answer here in just a second, but I want you to comment down below what you think your answer is. Luke, I want to see you in the comments, bro. What do you think the answer is, the difference between a drug and a medicine, and what makes that difference? Okay, I'm going to tell you the answer in 3, 2, get your comments ready. 1.
Make some fucking noise!
It is the dose. The dose is what makes the difference between a medicine and a drug. We see this with amphetamines, opioids, and everything else. And so my point here is that when we regulate these drugs to stop being recreational, we're not letting America be free, number one. You should have the freedom to safely use drugs. We already have a system that punishes drug users by making the drugs illegal, and then you don't even know what drugs you're buying on the street. You're buying fentanyl-laced shit. So if you could safely get that drug, you would be able to more safely use that drug because you know what the dose is, number one. Okay. You can then control for set and setting, which is what the whole psychedelic community talks about. Oh, you need set and setting to have a good psychedelic experience. And then they're trying to control for this in therapy sessions and saying that psychedelic assisted therapy is the drug. The psychiatry community is pushing back on that by saying the drug either helps with mental health, which we see from a neurobiological and neuropharmacological standpoint, or it doesn't. Because in the case of ADHD, we know that amphetamines is one of the best, most highly efficacious drugs, and we know how to safely administer those drugs. We know the safe doses of amphetamines and methylphenidate for children, for ADHD, excuse me. And so you see in this country that people say kids on ADHD meds, that's bad. They don't really have anything else to say about it other than that's bad, and it's because they think that kids taking drugs, there's no such thing as an intelligent use case for a child to take a drug. But if you look into the research of those with ADHD who are medicated earlier, their life is so much better. They're less likely to develop a drug addiction. They're less likely to get in a car accident. They're less likely to be homeless or struggle with getting a job. With that being said, if they are on medication, they're more likely to get a well-paying job. Ben Jordan, a music producer, just made an excellent, shout out to Ben Jordan, excellent video on, I should react to that video, on ADHD meds. And so, Luke, I would just push back on this, that when we are controlling for the environment, it's actually not the intelligent use case you think it is, because Native Americans have been doing psychedelic rituals for years, for thousands of years. And they have a serious problem with MAPS, because MAPS is like, we're the first people doing this psychedelic ritual thing, and like, we know how to do it, and we're going to get FDA approval. And the Native Americans are like, fuck you. We should be able to use our psychedelics however we want. If all this research is real, I should have the freedom to recreationally use these drugs in my preferred set and setting, not in the preferred controlled set and setting that you have deemed acceptable. And so this is a serious issue. Luke, I hope you see what I'm getting at. If you want to invite me on the podcast, bro, I'm a member of the channel. You know, longtime member of the channel, longtime subscriber. I love everything Luke does. Appreciate you, Luke. I actually asked you a question about whether you had ever thought about going to grad school years ago when I was thinking about dropping out, and then I did drop out after my cousins died. So yeah, with that being said, we're going to end the video. Down in the comment below, this is a fucking long one, guys. If you stuck around for the whole thing, I appreciate you. Thank you very much. And so, with that being said, hit the like, subscribe to the channel. I appreciate all you beautiful degenerates and donks. Peace out.
We would learn together and experience together how to reach the 5 levels of consciousness, which are available to a species like ours.
Drop out.